Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., she heard knocking from the woods. Martha had moved to the edge of the forest for peace and solitude. But solitude came with strange noises, branches snapping, distant whispers, and worst of all, the knocking. It started faint, like someone tapping on wood far off in the distance. At first, she convinced herself it was just animals or the wind. But it wasn't. The knocks grew louder each night, always at 3 a.m., always in a perfect rhythm, 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. One night, curiosity got the better of her. She stood by her window, staring into the pitch-black woods. As the knocks began, she squinted and swore she saw movement between the trees. A figure. The next day, she found strange marks on her porch, scratches, as though something had been dragged across the wood. Her front door had dents in it, perfectly spaced as if from bony fingers. That night, she stayed up with every light on, clutching a knife. When the knocking started, it was no longer distant. It came from her porch. Knock, knock, knock. Her hands shook as she moved toward the door. "Who's there?" she shouted. Silence. Then, the sound of something wet dragging across the porch. The knocks started again, louder, more frantic. Suddenly, a voice rasped from the other side. "Let me in." Terrified, she bolted to her bedroom and locked the door. From her window, she peeked out at the porch. There it was, a hunched figure, its face pale and hollow, eyes black pits that stared right into hers. It raised its hand and knocked on her window this time, smiling as it mouthed, "Let me in." The next morning, her neighbors found her house empty. The door was wide open, and deep in the woods, they found scratch marks on the trees, leading further into the dark. No one ever saw Martha again, but some nights, near the edge of the woods, people still hear the knocking. Knock, knock, knock. Jason had heard the stories about Blackridge Mountain, that campers often vanished without a trace, but he never believed them. Until he camped there himself. Jason was an experienced camper, the kind who laughed off ghost stories. When his friends warned him about Blackridge Mountain's eerie reputation, he scoffed. What's the worst that can happen? A bear shows up. That night, he pitched his tent at the base of the mountain, surrounded by towering pines and the distant sound of a river rushing below. The forest was unusually silent, but he chalked it up to the isolation. As he lit his campfire, he noticed something odd. There were no animal sounds. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just a heavy, oppressive silence. A cold wind brushed past him, making the fire flicker violently. Suddenly, he heard it, a faint whisper. It sounded like a woman's voice, carried on the wind. He froze, listening intently. "Help me," the voice begged, faint and desperate. Jason stood, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. "Hello, is someone out there?" he called, his voice trembling. No answer. Gripping his flashlight, he stepped away from the fire, shining the beam into the shadows. The trees loomed like skeletal fingers, and the beam barely penetrated the darkness. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Help me." His heart raced. "If someone's out there, say something. Are you hurt?" The voice didn't respond, but the air grew colder, biting at his skin. He backed toward his tent, unease gnawing at him. The fire suddenly went out, plunging him into darkness. Panicking, he fumbled to relight it, but his matches wouldn't spark. That's when he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching the dry leaves behind him. Jason spun around, shining his flashlight wildly. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. Then he saw her. A woman stood just beyond the flashlight's reach. Her figure was faint, almost transparent, dressed in a tattered white gown that swayed as if caught in an unseen breeze. Her face was obscured, but her eyes glowed faintly, like dim embers. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Help me." Jason's breath hitched. What happened to you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised an arm and pointed toward the mountain's peak. "Up there," she said, her voice cracking. "I'm still waiting for him." Jason felt a chill run down his spine. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer. "Who are you waiting for? What happened to you?" The woman's head snapped up, revealing her face. Jason stumbled backward, horrified. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and cracked like old porcelain. Her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, and her voice turned guttural. "He left me," she screamed, her voice echoing through the forest. Jason bolted toward his tent, but the ground beneath him felt wrong, like it was shifting. The trees seemed to close in, their branches twisting like hands reaching for him. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding him. "You can't leave." He tripped, falling hard onto the cold earth. Scrambling to his feet, he turned to see the woman standing mere inches away. Her face was contorted in rage, and her eyes burned brighter. "You'll stay with me," she hissed, her voice filled with venom. Like he did. Jason screamed and sprinted down the trail, his flashlight flickering wildly. The whispers followed him, growing louder, turning into cries and screams. The forest seemed alive, its shadows stretching toward him. Finally, he burst out of the trees and reached his car. Fumbling with his keys, he threw himself inside and started the engine. He sped away, his heart pounding, too terrified to look back. When he reached the bottom of the mountain, he stopped to catch his breath. The whispers were gone, and the silence of the forest felt thin. For years, Daniel had lived alone in the woods, but every night at exactly midnight, the spirits came. He couldn't see them, but he always knew they were there. Daniel moved to the secluded cabin for peace. A life of solitude among the towering pines and whispering winds was all he wanted. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the silence of the forest was his only companion. At first, the nights were uneventful, serene even. But within weeks, he began to notice strange things. It started with faint whispers. They would drift into his cabin on the cold night air, unintelligible but persistent. He tried convincing himself it was the wind or the trees creaking, but deep down, he knew better. One night, while reading by the fireplace, he heard footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. Gripping the fire poker, he approached the door and flung it open. Nothing. Only the vast darkness of the woods greeted him. But as he stared into the void, the footsteps continued, moving around the cabin, circling him. He slammed the door and locked it, his heart pounding. From that night onward, the visits became more frequent. At exactly midnight, he would hear the whispers. They grew louder each night, their words becoming clearer. "Daniel," they called, stretching his name into an eerie wail. Some nights, he heard scratching at his windows, though he lived too far above the ground for any animal to reach. Other nights, he woke to the sound of furniture moving, only to find his dining chairs stacked impossibly higher, his belongings scattered in patterns he didn't understand. One night, he decided to stay awake until dawn, determined to catch whoever, or whatever, was tormenting him. Armed with a flashlight and his old hunting rifle, he sat by the window, watching the forest. At midnight, the whispers began again. But this time, they were inside the cabin. "Why won't you come to us?" A voice rasped from the corner of the room. Daniel whipped around, shining his flashlight into the shadows. For a moment, he saw nothing, but then, slowly, a figure emerged. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones. His mouth was unnaturally wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth, and his eyes were deep, empty pits. He stared at Daniel, unblinking, as more figures materialized behind him. There were women, children, even animals, all twisted and decayed, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. "Leave me alone," Daniel shouted, firing his rifle. The shot echoed through the cabin, but the figures didn't flinch. Instead, they smiled. "You're already one of us," the first figure whispered, stepping closer. Terrified, Daniel fled into the woods, running blindly through the trees. The whispers followed him, growing louder, more mocking. He tripped and fell, the ground beneath him soft and wet. When he shone his flashlight down, he realized why. It was a shallow grave, filled with rotting bodies. The spirits surrounded him, their faces inches from his own. "You can't escape," they hissed in unison. "This is our home, and now, it's yours too." When Daniel woke the next morning, he was lying on his cabin floor. Everything was as it had been, as though the night before was just a nightmare. But when he stepped outside, he saw them. Dozens of faces, carved into the trees surrounding his cabin. Each one twisted in agony, and one face was unmistakably his own. To this day, no one ventures near Daniel's cabin. They say at night, you can still hear the whispers, calling for someone to join them.